Hello, everyone. My name is Kalev Bendour. I'm the editor of the Fathom Journal. I'm joined by my deputy editor, Andrew Apostolou, and we are incredibly excited to be joined by Howard Jacobson. He's a British Jewish novelist and journalist. He's written over 20 books, including 17 novels, and won the Booker Prize for fiction. He's also, at least according to something he said on a podcast we both enjoy, a long-term reader of Fathom. And this interview is going to focus on three of his books: The Finkler Question from 2010, Jay from 2014, and his most recent book, Howl. Howard, thank you so much for joining us. We're really excited to speak to you.
Thank you for inviting me. However excited you are, you won't be anything like as excited and anxious as I am. Normally, I love these and I proceed without any trepidation. But Fathom is a different thing for me, because Fathom is a place that I don't associate with talking about my work. Fathom is a place I go to read people who are not like me, actually, who are mainly historians, who know things. And I don't go in for knowing things. I'm a novelist, so guesswork is what I do. So I feel I'm in a place of authority and learning and scholarship, and I don't know whether I have any right to be here, but I will do my best. So thank you anyway for risking me.
You can always fake it till you make it. That's very kind of you. So I want to start with I guess a question about Jews and others. So central to the background of your book, Jay, which is incredibly dark, is that something terrible happened to a group of people who we assume it's inferred is implied as Jews 2 or 3 generations earlier. And it's referred to what happened if it happened. Now, that type of phrase also appears in your newest book, Howl, in which the janitor at Ferdinand Draxler's nursery school, he comes to talk to Ferdinand, and they discuss the events of October 2023. And you write this: Hashim's English wasn't perfect, but he employed the past conditional tense with great expertise. I am celebrating what we did. Had it been true, we did it, he said. What approach about Jews or Israel did you detect that led you to write about this theme and phrase?
Okay. Although they sound a little bit the same, what happened if it happened and what Hashim says are actually different. In writing Jay, I wanted to depict a country, probably England, but I don't say so, but it feels like England, living in the wake of living without certain people, and I don't say who they are, but you'd be pretty dumb not to know who they are, as the novel's called Jay. What I didn't want to do was name the catastrophe. I didn't want to say a Holocaust, because I didn't want to get into Holocaust vocabulary. I didn't even want to see that word. This was a stylistic thing. Did not want to see that word again after the Holocaust. This Holocaust, that Holocaust, your Holocaust. I just didn't want to see it. So this was partly a kind of stylistic fastidiousness, but it was more than that, and quickly became more than that, because once you say what happened if it happened, is you've implicated that whole world that you've created in deception. They won't admit that something happened. And because they wouldn't admit it, the not admitting it becomes as important as whatever it was that happened. Why won't they admit it? What are they concealing? What's gone on here? And the catastrophe is the deception, if you like. The catastrophe is that this is a world in which people won't admit that these people ever existed, actually. Because if you admit that something happened, you admit the existence of these people. But we're in a world in which these people are not allowed ever to have been, but for the few characters who decide something has now gone missing from this world. I didn't want to write one of those novels in which there is an early German novel about an early 20th century novel about Jews being kicked out of a town in Germany. I've forgotten his title. They're kicked out of a town in
Germany.
Yeah. And that's the story of how impoverished this place is without the Jews. I didn't want to write that story. there was a danger of sentimentality in that story. I didn't want to write how much the world will miss the Jews when they're gone. I simply wanted to write about the brutality of wanting to excise from your mind and your memory a particular people. So it's that. That's what happened if it happened is about. The janitor in Howl is completely different. The janitor in Howl echoes what struck me as extraordinary after October the 7th. That's to say, on the morning of October the 8th, because it took no time for this to happen at all. We're not talking about centuries or even hours. We're talking about minutes. There was a glorification of the massacre, a delight in to call it pain and suffering gets nowhere, delight in the brutality that had been visited upon Israelis, Zionists, which is how you talk about Jews now without using the word Jews, because they deserved it. The problem was those same people who wanted to celebrate also wanted to deny. I've never seen anything like that before. Because we didn't do it. Of course they didn't do it. Of course Hamas was not brutal. So Hamas didn't do anything brutal, and yet at the same time, its brutality was a wonderful win for them and a wonderful defeat for Israelis, Zionists, brackets, Jews. And I thought this was an extraordinary example of total and complete denial in the act of self-contradiction. And what was hard to believe was that people didn't realize that they were doing it. The one or two people I knew who took that side, but mainly I don't have friends who take that side, but the one or two people I did simply said, well, this is just a way of putting it. We can celebrate a victory, even though it wasn't the brutal victory you want it to have been. But that was just dodging it. People wanted to say two absolutely opposite things at once, that Jews had been hurt and that Jews hadn't been hurt. Either way, it was a defeat for the Jews. That was the beginning. The novel Howl was born out of that, actually, because by the end of the day on October the 8th, I thought we are living now in a total and complete madhouse, a madhouse in which words don't mean what they used to mean, language doesn't mean what it used to mean. The world's greatest feminists were on television defending rape. And you think, once that happens, where are we? Where everything has gone. It was a sort of carnival, actually. A carnival of everything turned upside down, a carnival of bloodletting.
I'm actually just thinking about this now, because of course one of Draxler's favorite books is about English grammar, and I guess their words should mean certain things, and actually what you're saying now is that completely went out the window. I'd like to ask you about the role you think Jews play for others. So one character in J is called Esme, and she wants to try to discover a solution to all the pent-up anger and frustration that society is now experiencing after what happened, if it happened. She concludes that those who'd been the object of what happened weren't just any old, I'm quoting from you now, weren't just any old interchangeable excuse for civil riot. Rather, they occupied a particular, even privileged place in the nation's taxonomy of fear and loathing. Now they needed to be replaced. So she tries to find a new minority for society to take out its anger on. She calls it an alternative, necessary opposite. Some other ethnic or religious group that could stand in as a hate object for that which had been obliterated. Now, in the meeting she's having, someone suggests maybe the Chinese as an option. But Esme doubts it would work. And then you write, this is a bit of a long quote, but I think it's worth sharing. You write that difference, which after all was easy to come by, was not in itself enough. You have to see a version of yourself where you've come from, or where you might, if aren't careful, end up, before you can do the cheek-to-cheek of hate. Family lineaments must be discerned, a reflection you cannot bear to see, an echo you cannot bear to hear. In other words, you must have chewed on the same bone of moral philosophy, subscribed to a similar spirituality, and even, at some point in the not too distant past, have worshipped at the same shrines. It was difference where there was so much that was similar that accounted for the unique antipathy of which they were in search. And only one people with one set of prints fitted that bill. Now, the suggestion, I think, is that Jews end up playing a unique role in the West. It seems as if Jews are objectified as figures through which the West works out its own anxieties. Can you talk a bit about what you mean by reflections you cannot bear to see and a version of yourself?
I can try. I'm not as good as Esme. Esme is, I think, a character I'm very proud of. And when you get somebody like that who's as conscientious a thinker as she is, they truly do take over. They do have thoughts that are not your thoughts. If once you let your characters go, if they're any good, they say better things than you. Esme could have written for Forward. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I could. Esme seeks clarity and certainty, and she's not a novelist. And I, as a novelist, wallow in. No, that's not that's not the right way to put it. Glory in, celebrate, just live in, inhabit uncertainty. Uncertainty is the only place I'm comfortable in. I don't know anything. I guess things. And what I was doing when writing Esme and giving her certitudes was guessing what a good certitude on this subject might be. I've not studied it. I've not done the psychological research into anti-Semitism, which some people have. But those who have come up with versions of understanding, come up with, yes, understanding similar to this. Because what is it that has kept the Jews the number one enemy of humanity for 2,000 years? I'm not now going to talk about our wonderful resilience. I'll leave that to others to talk about. But just why has mankind not found anybody else? Why has mankind not found? It's found enemies. It's found people it dislikes. And in certain countries, attempts are made to wipe out one another. But any attempt to do to others what has been done to Jews has not remotely worked. And the question has been asked many, many times why it is that when civilizations, nations, people do finally get rid of Jews, as the Spanish did for a while after when so many Jews were put into exile, some of whom went, of course, to Israel, and as of course the English did in the 12th century, if it was the 11th or the 12th century. You get rid of the people that you feel are your natural enemies, the bloodsuckers, those who steal your money, those who are corrupting you, those who are just spreading evil. And nothing changes. It's always fascinating to me that Shylock, the Merchant of Venice, and the Jew of Malta, two of those most successful, iconic plays, if you like, about anti-Semitism, were written in an England that hardly had any Jews. There were hardly any there. Scholars have shown that it's very unlikely that Shakespeare ever met a Jew. He may have seen a Jew hang once, but that's about it. So where does it come from? Why were those plays so popular? What was it in that? What was it in the civilization of that time that needed people? That meant that people needed to hate the Jew when they didn't know one. What was that? And the answer doesn't have to be that they feared in the Jew something that they feared in themselves. But since only they were left in the battle between them and the Jews had gone, who was it now that they were fearing? And you have to ask yourself if it was because the Jews resembled themselves. For the West, this takes one all the way back to Christianity. And even Christianity's discomfort with Christianity, the number of times Christian movements have had to rework what Christianity means to them, and in the process get rid of the Jews, is pretty well taken as historical fact by people who study that. It is fascinating to me that they can't get that the people who hate Jews, once they've taken action against Jews, can't get them out of their system. It's as if the Jew won't go away. Now, I don't know I don't know if what Esme says is true, but I like it. Um, and she convinces me. But there's enough truth in it, I think, to bear any attempt at refutation. If it's not that, then you tell me what it is. It's the best I can do with that. But for a novelist, that will do. That's plenty. That is plenty to go on.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's fascinating, and I liked your reference to Hugo Bettauer's novel on a city without Jews. You mentioned that in the Finkler Question, you published it in 2010. This is obviously 13 years before October the 7th and the subsequent, excuse me, genocide accusations. But back then, you already had characters, or rather, you already spoke about how the opponents of Israel were co-opting it as a language. And in that book, the characters go to see a play called Sons of Abraham, which appears to be based on seven Jewish children. And, there's a scene in it in which there's a certain, references to, Wagner and Auschwitz and this kind of thing. Now, the fact that this was written so many years before October 7th and the subsequent war in Gaza is an interesting reminder, I think, of how the genocide canon towards Israel is not as new as we might think. Can you reflect a bit on what motivated you to write about it?
I can't remember how long that was since. What was the year in which we came out of Gaza and handed Gaza to the Palestinians?
2005.
Okay, so I was writing this I would have been writing the Finkler Question in the few years after that. It always seemed to me, although it was a bold step, and its boldness is not contradicted by the fact that it failed so badly, but it seemed to me that the optics of it were always going to be terrible, because it would look like it would be called an open air prison, and it would look like Israelis were holding captive people in this small piece of land on whom they could rain down bombs at will. If you wanted to say that, you could say it, and it would look that way. I wasn't the only one to be anxious about that, not least as those very things were being said on the streets of London. People would. I don't remember if there was a war between. Was there a Gaza war between 2005 and 2010? Whether there was or not, I can't remember. The streets of London were full then, not quite so full as they are now, but were full then of people demonstrating against Israel and Zionism. And you could feel this was not the end of it. You could feel only bad could come of this. And you would argue against it. You would argue against it all your life. Or you could argue against it all you liked, but the demonstrations wouldn't go away. The flag wearing, the scarf wearing would not go away. These things happened on the streets of London. And then this play. And this play, based, as you say, on apologetically based on seven Jewish children, which I also reviewed and talked about, gave a sort of explained to me the first real sense I had of what was going on. There was a new tack. There was a new way of attacking Jews that I'd not come across before. And it was to invert the Holocaust and to turn the Jews into, if you like, the new Nazis. That's melodramatic, but that's what many of the people marching on the streets said. And what seven Jewish children said was, whatever had been done to the Jews, these poor Jewish children, the Jews would now visit on their enemies, who happened to be, in this instance, the Palestinians. And it was when I saw that the Holocaust denial was over. There'd still be a few Meshuggahs who'd go climbing over the rooftops with set squares and prove that this couldn't have happened. But the smarter ones saw that there was a better way of proceeding, and that was admit the Holocaust, admit how terrible the Holocaust was. If possible, make the Holocaust even worse than it was. Because if the Holocaust was really so terrible, how come the Jews had not learnt a scrap of humanity from it? How come the Jews had simply suffered that in order to, what's the causation here, visit the Holocaust of their own upon the innocent. And this looked, you could see even in those years. Now, of course, it's not even hidden. A friend of mine, who is an actor, and I won't say in what be, it bears a relation to a well-known Holocaust denier, except he doesn't deny it anymore. A well-known anti-Israeli intellectual. And my friend said once the UN was starting to speculate about genocide, called, notice, always the genocide, that definitive article, that definitive "the" is very, very important in the way they use the genocide. It kind of pushes aside any other genocide. You want to see a genocide, we'll show you a genocide. And my friend, for his socialist friend, and how often they are socialists, the genocide charge was the icing on the cake. This was the one that they'd been waiting for. If we could land the charge of being genocidal upon the Jews, they'd got them. That was it. That removed the nuisance of the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a nuisance to people who hate Zionists and Israel, because the Holocaust went on conferring pity on Jews, and they didn't want pity on Jews. They resented it. They were envious of it. They even, there was even a feeling that I've sometimes thought, is it fair to say this? I'll say it whether it's fair to say it or not, that the Nakba was the Palestinian answer to the Holocaust. We also had one. There was Holocaust envy. Can you believe that? I feel there has been Holocaust envy in the world. How do we get rid of envy? We get something better. We buy something better. We are given something better. And what was better than the Holocaust the Jews suffered, propaganda-wise, was the Holocaust that the Jews visited upon others. Sorry, that's quite a mouthful.
No, that's great. And your memory is correct. There was a Gaza war at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. And interestingly, it was David Cameron who called Gaza a prison camp, which shows you how widespread this kind of idea is.
Yes.
So I want to ask you about, are we facing something new? So we've talked about the genocide label and how it's been around for a while. In Howl, Ferdinand describes how Holocaust denial, you've alluded to this, has been superseded by a crime still more iniquitous. It was so crooked that no straight word yet existed to describe it. People don't deny atrocity, they welcome it. And in another part of the book, he relates how what really shocked him wasn't just the massacre, but the speed at which morality went into reverse. So, to what extent do you think that the phenomena that many Jews in the UK and around the world have experienced the last 3 years, since October the 7th, represent something new, or again, are we just reworking the past?
I don't think it's new in kind. And I can't argue it's new in kind, since I was already seeing it 15 years ago. Is that how long ago it was? Yeah, 15 years ago. It's not new in kind, it's new in intensity. It's new in that the idea that there may have been, it was more tentative. Could we, even 7 Jewish children, for all its violence and vileness, still did not land that charge on Israel, on Zionists, therefore, by implication, on Jews, with the assurance of finality that they do now. I noticed when it was first coming up again in the early after October the 7th, several of the best presenters I've given up listening to the BBC. It made me too angry, although I've always been a BBC admirer, but not any longer. And I now listen to versions of talk radio. And I noticed that they have some of the best presenters would not allow someone ringing in to say the genocide. They would say, hang on, that's not proven. That's just a canard. That's just an accusation that's just without foundation. So I'm not going to allow you to say the genocide. And several of the best of them did that conscientiously for weeks and even months. Some of the worst of them did not, They bought into the genocide. Someone said the genocide, fine, the genocide. But little by little, even the best of them allowed it to happen, allowed people to say it and pass, as though they ran out of the energy to contradict it. That strikes me as very terrifying, that they, some of us, some of them, run out of the energy to contradict a heinous lie. If you don't contradict this seems to me one of the most terrible things of this moment. We are allowing the lie to be normalized, that and many other lies, to be normalized, because we haven't got the energy to go on, because it sounds nitpicking, because it sounds party pre, because it sounds as though you're just a Zionist fellow traveler. So you let it be said until little by little the genocide was the genocide, and there is no questioning it. And once that's happened to language, once we can talk about the genocide and everybody knows what you mean and which genocide and who committed it and against whom, you're in a lot of trouble, because history has changed. It's been a remarkable success story, I think, what Hamas pulled off. Not in their wildest dreams could they have imagined that a mere massacre of a mere few thousand Zionists and Israelis could change the way the world actually looks at Israel, Zionists and Jews, to the point now where, well, you don't want to do the maths or anything like that, but it wouldn't surprise me if someone did, a comprehensive survey, if they discovered that 55% of people believe that the Jews have committed and are committing a genocide wherever they next move. I mean, I know the genocide's moved to Lebanon now. Whatever Israel now does, it will be called a genocide. And here is the big question: how do we stop that? How do we stop that? When I talk to Jewish groups, and when I've talked to Jewish groups about Howl, I say, well, you've got to stop it. It's in your hands. Every time you hear the genocide or whichever other lie, or the idea that I've heard that there were during the Gaza war, that there were sitting on every post, every lamppost, every roof, a sniper, an Israeli sniper whose only job was just to kill Israeli children. I heard it so often. I remember saying to my wife, could that? And we both said, no, that could not have been, but who knows what could not have been. But that's the effect of the lie. The lie told and told and told again becomes the truth. And I don't now know whether I'm answering your question because I've wandered off, but I think this is the thing that makes now so much more terrifying than then. Truly terrifying, I think.
I want to ask you about kind of Jews amongst ourselves, or Jews amongst themselves. So one theme that appears in your books is that of Jewish shame. So I'd like to share three scenes from what you've written. So in Finkler, there's this humorous passage, and this is, I actually remember when Finkler came out, and at Shabbat dinner tables, Jews loved this particular passage. I guess because they realized how true it kind of was. So there's a humorous passage in which a celebrity character discovers his Jewish ancestry on camera while filming a documentary, weeping at an Auschwitz memorial when he learned of dead relatives he never knew existed, and afterward tells the interviewer that revelation might explain his comic talent. And then you write this: having been born a Jew on Monday, he joined the ashamed Jews by Wednesday. By the following Saturday, he was photographed chanting, "We are all Hezbollah," outside the Israeli embassy. So that's scene one. In a later conversation, or maybe better to say an argument between Sam Finkler and his friend Libor, Finkler exclaims how it's not peculiar to Jews to dislike what some Jews do. Libor responds, no, but it's peculiar to Jews to be ashamed of it. It's our shtick. Nobody does it better. We know the weak spots. We've been doing it so long, we know exactly where to stick the sword. And then the third scene, which is in your most recent book, Howl, the narrator, Ferdinand Draxler, is talking about his brother Isaac, who stopped becoming ultra-Orthodox. He returns to London, and he's attending an anti-Israel march. And Draxler wonders whether, is this what motivates Jews who march with people who openly seek their extermination? Are they so ashamed of their provincial Zionist uncles, so desperate to prove they bear no relation to them, that they would rather resemble their murderers? Elsewhere, Drax is particularly annoyed by what he terms a volunteer woodlouse Jew who'd moved into Judaism only to gnaw away at it from the inside. Can you talk a little bit about Jews and shame?
Yeah, I can talk a lot. Funny to talk about Jews and shame, because normally when the anthropologists talk about guilt shame as opposed to guilt culture as opposed to shame culture, it's the Arab cultures that have a shame culture, and the Jew cultures that have a and the Jews who have a guilt culture. Rabbi Sachs wrote wonderfully about this, about how the Jews don't have a shame culture because they answer, or it's internal. They answer to the Almighty, and what they feel is guilt. If they've done something wrong, they feel guilt. Shame is worrying about what other people think about you. In fact, I worried about this. I worry about this more now. I've been thinking about it in relation to your questions, because it's a little confusing, because I'm not using shame in that sense. I think the shame that I discern in the Jews who want to go on these marches that we've had in London, what seems like every day, is not a shame about. They're not ashamed of themselves. They're not at all ashamed of themselves. It's not shame in that sense. They are actually exceedingly proud of themselves. And that's why it's a mistake to talk about Jewish self-disgust in this instance and Jewish self-hate. They don't hate themselves, they adore themselves. And they believe that they are acting as the only true Jews, that God Almighty would approve what they're doing, because did not God Almighty tell us, well, he never told us to march against the state of Israel, but he would have, is the idea, because they are the true Jews. What they are ashamed of is nothing in themselves, because they have nothing to be ashamed of in themselves. They are proud and sanctimonious. What they are ashamed of is any kind of affirmation of Judaism. Just as it reminds me of some of those first opponents, and still opponents, of Zionism, who didn't know why did Jews have to have their own country? Why did they have to have, what was this yearning for a Jewish nationalism? What was wrong with hanging around the edges of other people's cultures and picking up the scraps and being clever, being witty and being funny, but being a permanent diaspora of the soul? That was good. That was what we wanted from Jews. We did not want a strong affirmation of the Jewish self. And I think that's what they are ashamed of. They are ashamed of the fact that they're actually ashamed of Jews winning. When Jews win, that's what they don't like. What they want to see is Jewish loss, because in Jewish loss, you have the agony, you have the tortured Jewish soul, you have all that's good about the Jew, and so on. I'm putting together different things here, because the scene that you said you liked and other Jews liked, and I'm delighted to hear that they did, in which someone who isn't Jewish discovers is Jewish, and then says, that's wonderful, that explains why I've got a sense of humor. And he goes to shul he discovers this on Tuesday, and he goes to shul on Friday, and by the following weekend is marching for Hezbollah. That's an exaggeration. It didn't take that long. They did it in hours. And I mean, I could give you names. I won't, of course, but I could give you names of real. That wasn't even made up. They did it. They told me they were proud. But the Jew that they were proud of being was the Jew who was ashamed of being a Jew. How do you get your mind around the twistedness of that? That someone might say, I love the Jews. I love the fact that they've turned themselves one kind of people into another. I love the fact that, while all the odds were against them, they stood up for themselves. And this time there was not going to be another Holocaust. And this time they would fight a fight to the end. I could imagine anybody saying, I would like to be that kind of Jew. That's the kind of Jew I would like to be. But that someone would say, I want to be a Jew that's really ashamed of himself, that wants to apologize for being, this suits me. Well, the psychology of that is fascinating. I think that the shame of the real Jew, not the assumed Jew, the real Jew who goes on a march every weekend. And not long ago, I ran into some. I was somewhere where I was out on Saturday, and in London, you have to be careful where you are at the weekend, Saturday or Sunday, because you might walk into a march, and you don't want that, or I don't want that. And I was somewhere where I thought there would be no march, but I'd got my geography wrong, and there was to be a march right past the park where I was having a quiet cup of coffee. And suddenly a bunch of Jews moved towards me, and they were wearing Palestinian scarves and carrying anti-Jewish banners. And they came up to me, greeted me. They knew who I was. I didn't know who they were. Well, I did. They only knew what I'd written. I knew what they felt in their souls. And they spoke to me in Hebrew. Although I was taught Hebrew at school, and had a bar mitzvah and sang in my portion in Hebrew, I've got no Hebrew. I'm bad on languages, and I'm particularly bad on. But whatever it was they said to me, I took exception to. Not the sentiment, the fact that they were even using Hebrew words. And I said to them, and I couldn't, afterwards, I thought I shook in horror at my own sanctimonious this time. I said, how dare you? How dare you use the Hebrew language? You who have abandoned everything that is true about the Jew. How dare you employ the Hebrew words? And I was so passionate about this, hypocrite as I was, since they knew more Hebrew than I did, that I believe I struck fear into them. I believe I was, for the moment, a patriarch that they feared, and they moved on. I like to think that they moved on ashamed, ripped the scarf off their neck, and went to bed and remembered who their God really was and apologized. But I doubt that they did. That doesn't take us anywhere, really. But I do go on talking. What interests me, sorry, let's go this way. What interests me about the shame thing is it's the old thing just in a new package. It's the what makes a Jew ashamed of those Jews who won't oppose Israel and won't oppose Zionism. Their shame is the same shame which several hundred years ago would have caused them to change their name and made them want to be Gentiles and take to fox hunting and call themselves St. John Christian St. John and live in the Cheshire countryside and go to hounds. It's the same Jews who I don't know whether either of you have read a really wonderful novel whose name I've forgotten. It was written by Jonathan Miller. You remember Jonathan Miller of Jewish fame. His mother was a novelist, and in the 1930s, before Jonathan Miller was born, she wrote a novel. Was she called Jane Fisher? She wrote a novel about Jewish shame. Very, very early on. You wouldn't have thought there was that much Jewish shame in London at that time, but there was. And she talks about what it's like for a Jew who wants to get on in the world to accept a lift from another Jewish friend and not like the way his very Jewish friend dresses, not like his shoes, not like the loudness of his ties. There is a strong feeling that has always been, I observed it, maybe I even suffered it myself growing up in Jewish Manchester, a strong feeling among Jews, a strong feeling of intellectual embarrassment. We are so provincial. We are so parochial. The Jewish Chronicle, which is now quite a strong, very strong mouthpiece and publishes good, strong articles, was just in my day when I was growing up, it told you who'd been bar mitzvahed, who was having a tea, what Jewish football team had scored a goal for the first time in 70. It was just a kind of litany of small-minded parochial chit-chat. And that's what intellectual Jews have wanted to escape from. We don't want to be that kind of a person. We go to Oxford and Cambridge, we read philosophy, and we don't want to be, and if you're like, as Jonathan Miller couldn't wait to ditch Jewishness altogether. He hated the whole thing of being called Jewish. So that Jewish stuff in the famous review sketch, I'm not a Jew, I'm just Jewish. It was thought a wonderful joke, but he actually meant it. And I think this fear of parochialism comes before the fear of everything else. First, you don't like the loud ties that your Jewish friend wears. Then you don't like to get caught reading the Jewish Chronicle. And it's not a long march from there to then going on a parade through London. Sorry, I go on.
No, you
asked the question, so it's your fault.
That's fantastic. And to be reminded of Jonathan Miller's mother is also great reference. I'm looking it up. In Finkler, you have a character, interestingly named after Hezekiah's wife, Hepzibah, who's not sleeping well. and you describe how an anxiety had settled like a fine dust on everything she did, on everyone she knew, on all the Jews at least. They were looking askance, not over their shoulders exactly, but into a brittly, uncertain future which bore fearful resemblances to and only too certain past. While certain things had fallen quiet in the Middle East, Hepzibah feels that the rage that clung onto the coattails of news reports had temporarily abated. And I love that phrase, the rage that clung onto the coattails of news reports. Can you reflect on that rage and your feelings? You've just alluded to, you anticipated my question with your wonderful anecdote. What it's like to be Jewish in Britain at the moment, and how in Jay, also that novel, we hear a young woman talking about the "it couldn't happen here" society and the Never Again League. Is this a league in a society you felt yourself moving between in different parts of your life?
Moving between now more than ever. My wife and I, my wife's Jewish, and we both went to English universities and pursued, non-specific Jewish careers. She made television films. I wrote books, taught, and then wrote books. I never thought I would write about things Jewish. She took no interest in things Jewish, really. She was Jewish, and that was it. Films she made had nothing to do with it. But suddenly we find ourselves asking questions we would never have dreamed of asking in our youth, when as young devil-may-care Jews, and they liked us or they didn't, who cared? We would never have dreamed of this thing. Should we stay or should we go? And the question we've been having over the last few years is, had we been living in Berlin now, what would we have done? Had it been, when would we have made a decision to go? 1929, 1932, 1935, 1936, too late now? Would we have made a decision to go? Or would we have thought it'll be all right, the way so many Jews perfectly sensibly, because you cannot conceive a Holocaust until there's been one. The trouble is, there's now been one. And there having been one, that makes a difference to the urgency with which you ask this question. Yet still, we stay. Yet still, although we have several friends who have left England, maybe they've not sold their houses permanently, but some have, some haven't, to make Aliyah, and say to us, you must come, you will have a wonderful life here, you must come. And we think about it, and we think about the sunshine and the beaches and the good Australian food and wine. That's something I never thought I'd say. Good Australian wine. And still we don't go. Sorry, I saw good Israeli wine. Sorry, excuse me. Australia is one of the places I did bolt to once. Still we don't go. And we're not sure. And different things happen at different times, and we wonder how it's going to be. But we are definitely caught between that. I suspect we won't go. I suspect we will think it's common sense to stay. And whether that common sense will be thrown in our faces, as it was thrown in the faces of so many tragic Berlin Jews, I don't know. But yes, I think this is common. And the minute I raise this, somebody in Howl asks this question of the headmaster, and he doesn't know how to answer it. And when I go to talk about Howl, people will say to me, rather shamefaced, "We're thinking this. We are thinking maybe it's time to go." And they ask me, and what do I know? Do I know when it's time to go? I make everything up. I live in uncertainty. Therefore, I don't know. My answer to you is, I don't know. That's what the wisdom of the novelist's wisdom of the ages. I don't know. Ask me. But it's the fact that we are asking it now with urgency is a sign of where things are at the moment.
So there's an interesting response, and I don't know if it's specifically Jewish or not. Maybe you can even comment on that. A response to danger, abuse, and uncertainty that you touch on in Finkler. So Siba is retelling a story to her non-Jewish boyfriend Treslav, who, for those who have read or those who haven't even, he's very eager to be Jewish, and actually he doesn't really get all of the ashamed stuff. In some ways, he relates to what you were saying earlier, Howard, about how all of the positive things an outsider might think about Jews. Anyway, she's telling him of this time when bacon is smeared on the entrance to the Jewish Museum. And you write that Treslov realizes that she's not going from fear to amusement and back again. She was experiencing both emotions simultaneously. It wasn't even a matter of reconciling opposites, because they were not opposites for her. Each partook of the other. He didn't know how to do what she did. He didn't possess the emotional flexibility. He wasn't sure he wanted to. Wasn't there an irresponsibility in it? So I'd like to ask you about what you term emotional flexibility in Jews. Can you talk about this sort of Jewish response?
I think it's our great intellectual achievement. I was never able to persuade Jonathan Sachs, Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, of this when we talked about it. I was never able to quite persuade him that it was our chief moral achievement, our main moral achievement too, that the thing that we call our sense of humor, which is so much more than that, which is the ability to see the ludicrous in the solemn, the farcical in the terrifying, and just to put it at its simplest, the comic in the tragic. It's something we have learned how to, something our experience has taught us how to do. Or it's something, if the other way of putting it is, what if we had not learned to do that, maybe we would not have been here talking about it at all. Maybe we would not have been here. Is that the secret of our success? That somewhere or other, whatever the seriousness of what we have achieved, whatever the somber philosophy that Judaism has produced, it has also produced, and at our best we know it is just as much part of us, Mel Brooks, which sometimes is, we might think of as silliness, but then you might also think it's a silliness that has a saving grace, that it reminds us. The Producers is, I think The Producers is, I've probably seen it a few too many times, but I think The Producers is a wonderful example of this, that you take the most terrible thing that's happened and you make a sublime joke of it, a sublime joke, and you turn that sublime joke upon those who have visited this catastrophe on you. The Jewish capacity the Jews' capacity to laugh at themselves surpasses all others. No one can laugh at themselves as well as the Jews do. See, already I'm boasting about it. Already I'm, and already there's reason for people who hate Jews to hate me more. They boast. He's boasting again. They're so boastful. But we are very, very good at it, and so good at it that yes, it's true. We will. It's as if we look at those we are even embarrassed to call our enemies, because call people our enemies. Even that's too melodramatic. But we do have enemies. And it's as if what we say to them is, whatever you say to us, however cruel you are to us, however abusive your language is to us, we can do it better. We can be ruder about a Jew than you will ever be. We beat you. We beat you. Even at anti-Semitism, we beat you. Well, of course, allowing that the joke still runs, that's a joke that might be on us. I suppose if I were an enemy of the Jews and I were poking them into the fire, I would say, yeah, you're right. Your anti-Semitism beats us, but my fork is longer than yours, and our flames roar higher than yours. So you never know, really. Assuming this is never ever decided, we will never know whether this capacity of ours has been a successful strategy for going on living, but it is a strategy for survival. So that the number of nights I've been out with fellow Jews over the last years, and we begin by discussing how terrified we are, how frightened we are. Have you bought your ticket yet? Have you gone? Will you dare to stay? With the latest example of monstrosity that's been said, and within half an hour we're roaring with laughter at the nonsense of it. Even if you like, it's very hard to make a joke of the genocide, but you can have a lot of fun with that definite article. You can have fun with it, and we do have fun with it. And I think that's what I mean. And that's what I mean when I say it's not that we put the opposites of comedy and tragedy together. We just about don't know the difference. They have melded. We've had so much, I hope this isn't being sentimental or melodramatic, but we've had so much tragedy that there's nothing else we can do with it. We either succumb to it and we live. And comedy, joking, wit, the mind, because comedy isn't, a good joke isn't just a means for making people laugh. A good joke is an act of the intellect. It's an act of understanding. It's a creative act. It's part of our creativity. We change the thing that we see. We change the thing that is done to us into something else. And that's a triumph, I think. But we mustn't be triumphant without also reminding ourselves of how ludicrous we can be in our triumphalism.
Right, that's fantastic. There's a very interesting conversation in Howl. I'm sorry, we're reminding you of your previous novels. I don't know, for a writer like you, it may feel like returning to the scene of the crime, but anyhow.
It's a bit hard to remember them, I have to say. So thank you. It's been nice to hear some of the sentences again.
Well, so there's a conversation in Howl between Ferdinand and his brother Isaac, and the conversation is, it goes along this way. We fell quiet, then he returned to marveling that I'd never been to the country in which he'd missed out on the godless, carefree youth I'd enjoyed, and on whose behalf I had a lot to say. You don't visit an idea, I said. What do you do with it? You entertain it. Now, in Finkler, you talk about people wearing kaffirs, so this relates to your recent anecdote. And you write, but on an Englishman, it only ever denoted that greed for aggression, someone else's cause, wedded to a nostalgia for simplicities that never were, that was bound to make a refugee from the horrors of leftism shudder. Now, can you talk to us a little bit about what it means to entertain an idea rather than visit it, and also the adoption by one side of an argument who has no connection to it, and this nostalgia for simplicities, which again may be something we're experiencing a lot of now.
Yes, that's tough to get my mind around all that. I suppose the idea of entertaining an idea, entertaining even a country as an idea rather than visiting it, that's to say knowing it, that's to say possessing it as a living felt experience, is a novelist's idea. That's what you do when you're writing a novel. I can entertain them. I've written endlessly about Israel. I wrote about Israel before even going there. And in fact, I only went to Israel eventually when I was quite old, I suppose in my 50s, by my then wife, who wasn't Jewish, who also entertained an idea of Israel, but she wanted to possess it. And for her too, there were simplicities there. I always don't you, I'll put it as a question, don't you always mistrust people who adopt other people's faiths? It looks like a kind of magnanimous thing to do. I'm so impressed by the philosophy of what you believe, I will embrace it. Never seen a single I've never, it's just my limited experience, you might think, but I've never seen an example of it yet that doesn't chill me to the bone. What is it that they want? It's very rare that you see people say, I want to become this kind of, I want to believe in this kind of faith or that kind of faith. And the faith that they're talking about, say, is Keynesian economics or Aristotelian philosophy. They don't want what's complicated. They want what they can dress up as. They want what they can wear a flowing robe to, or some sort of embroidered skull cap to. They want that. They want that which they can make manifest, physically manifest, easily in the street, all at once. And on every occasion, that's a simplicity. And on every occasion, forgive me, although it's dressed up as every occasion, most occasions, although it is dressed up in happiness and sweetness and kindness, it terrifies the life out of me because I always feel there is a hidden vileness there. Not violence, sorry, violence there. And that the violence is already there in the ripping yourself apart from your own culture. Why do you ever want to do that? Why do you want to rip yourself apart from your own culture? Why do that? And having ripped yourself from your own culture to embrace somebody else's, what is that? What is that about? And doesn't it have at its very soul, as an act of apostasy, some degree of violence, whenever somebody is an apostate in Shakespeare, and there are a few, they always regret it. They often kill themselves afterwards. How could I have done that? I always think of Enobarbus leaving Antony because he can't bear now what Antony has become under the sway of Cleopatra, although he loved Cleopatra and loves Antony. And having done that, he just can't live with him. He just can't live with himself. I think that's how apostates should feel. Okay, you've done the apostasy, tried it, now throw yourself into the Nile or wherever it is. I've lost myself here.
It was about adopting the simplicities and that nostalgia for simplicities.
Well, yes, I think I've addressed that about the nostalgia for simplicity. That's because there is no simplicity. It doesn't exist. My Australian wife, who took me to Israel, and when we got there on the plane, she said, "Darling, we're arriving home." And I said, "This is not home. This actually isn't home. I mean, I don't feel it's home. I feel it's a very important place, and I'm fascinated by what I'm going to think. But it's not home to call it home. Home's Manchester, and Manchester isn't like. I don't get excited in this way and you certainly don't get excited when I take you back to meet my mother. So let's not talk about home." But then we got off the plane, and she said, "Darling, kiss the tarmac." I thought, no. What she wanted was she wanted me to be smitten in a very simple way, kissing tarmac in a very smitten way by it. It was not enough for her to entertain the idea of Israel. We wanted to embrace it. She wanted me to embrace it at that moment. It didn't last long. A few things happened on our trip there, and she was off it again. But that was what she wanted. And that, for me, is the difference between entertaining an idea. I talked about Israel. Israel was an intellectual construct, but it didn't mean I had to go there. It didn't mean I had to love it. It didn't mean I had to love Israelis. Whenever people said to me, "Are you a Zionist?" And I would say, "Well, I'm not an anythingist. I'm a novelist. The only ist I am is a novelist. And that means I'm not certain of anything." But Zionism seems to be admirable and had to happen and necessary. And then people would say, "But they're not very nice people," or something. And you just said, "Well, who's very nice people? They're not very nice people. Tell me where there are very, very nice people. There aren't. You don't have to, but they wanted to embrace the simplicity. Somehow or other, I am putting things together here because of Andrew's tricky question. And I'm not happy with what I'm saying, but I'm getting tired, so it'll have to do.
But you've answered it very well, and you've gone back to your original theme, which is the uncertainty that you deal with in your novels, and the uncertainty that we all have to deal with, and that we have to actually confront the complications of life rather than look for the simple answers. But I'll hand over now to my colleague.
Yes, I actually want to pick up on that because you've actually mentioned that a couple of times already about the uncertainty versus the I guess the definiteness. So I want to ask you about the role of understanding and empathy, or their absence in the general debate about Israel. So in Finkler, he's doing a debate. He's speaking against Israel, and there's two pro-Israel Jews, and he thinks their arguments are very predictable. And then you write this. He wonders why they didn't hire him to write their scripts. He basically thinks he could have won it for them. You win by understanding something of what the other side thinks, and they understood nothing. So that's kind of one example. In Howl, and I was thinking about this as you were beginning your initial answers. Draxler describes the eyes of one of the demonstrators. They're blazing with the piercing white light of someone who'd seen God. He feared that if she ever allowed herself to look long enough at a painting, the pureness of her gaze would strip away the paint. So I'm curious about whether for you there's kind of empathy on one side, and that's its opposite, the piercing white light of certainty, as in order to have empathy, does a person need to feel they're not 100% correct in their opinions? What might a kind of an understanding or empathetic approach of kind of both sides in this debate look like?
I'm not sure I'm an empathetic man. and I'm not sure I can claim the empathy I ought to possess. I was conscious when writing Howl, conscious when talking about it now, that particularly in relation to Zoe, Ferdinand's sister, Ferdinand's daughter, I'm sorry, who goes on a march and calls him a Zio pig and says a lot of the horrible things that people who go on those marches say, and does one of the most horrible things that was ever done in the few years here in England after October the 7th, and that was to rip a poster of an Israeli hostage off a wall. And I've seen that. I've seen somebody doing that with my own eyes, and there are lots of examples of it. And it's an unforgivable act. And I could not feel empathy for a person who did that. I don't think I could ever feel empathy for a person who did that, no matter what their reasoning would be, because it itself. How do you feel empathy for someone who is herself so lacking in it, so signally lacking in it, to pull down the poster of someone who's been captured, might very well be dead, might very well have been tortured, has done nothing to deserve it, though of course people would argue what he's done to deserve it is he's a Jew, a Zionist. So lacks empathy that it's very hard to find empathy in return. Maybe one should. If I were a different kind of novelist, if I were a George Eliot, maybe I would make myself, but I'm not a George Eliot. I come at it, much as I admire George Eliot, I come at it a different way.
But sorry, but Howard, there is something you've mentioned about the certainty of many people, and you are placing that in contrast to what you said of self about what you've said about yourself, which is, I don't always know the answers. I'm not 100% certain that I'm correct. Those two do seem to be contrasting in your thought and writing.
What are the two contrasting things? I'm not certain I'm correct. No, I'm not certain I'm correct, but I forget too often, that I'm not certain I'm correct, and some things strike me as so heinous and unforgivable and untrue that I feel I'm correct. When people, for example, say that Zionism was a movement in which those Jews who were early Zionists turned up as settler colonialists, that vile phrase, to rape, pillage, and conquer the land of Palestine, although I wasn't there before my time anyway. I know that's not true. I just know that's not true. I know from everything I've read and everything I've surmised and everything I've intuited, but mainly everything I've read and everything that I understand of where the Jews were at that period in their history. I know that is not correct. There's a certitude, if you like, that I as a novelist should not possess. But whatever my incertitudes, you can't go only within. Somewhere you have to make some exceptions for yourself. Somewhere you have to say, that is not true. That is a lie. And the lies proliferate. The lies have been everywhere you look in the last 3 years in this country and all over, actually, wherever Jews are talked about. And maybe I have to step out of my novel in order to say, well, I won't accept those lies and I will fight those lies. And my belief that I might not know any better abandons me at this moment, because I do know better. I do know better than that. And I must say better than that. There is you are in a conflict as a novelist with the journalist in yourself or with the critic in yourself, which was what made two of the novelists I most admired, D.H. Lawrence and Milan Kundera, write marvelously about how novelists should not ever be journalists. They both were. Novelists should not have ideas. Novelists should not know things. That's not their job. Whenever they embrace or go anywhere near a belief system or an ideology, they make a fool of themselves and they betray their art. Although I actually believe that, I know why there are moments why writers like that move out of their creative world, if you like, and let rip as journalists. And there's a part of me that wants to do that and has done that. So I am not in toto, in the whole of me, wholly a person of uncertitudes. I am not. And that means that I do not have as much. When you talk about empathy, How much empathy do I want? How much empathy is it that I want? Is it empathy that I'm after at the moment? You know, if we are to understand one another more, is it empathy that I want from Palestinians? Is it empathy I want to show them? Although I cannot bear, like anybody else, I see the photographs of the filming of death and destruction, and I cannot bear it, and I shed tears like anybody else. Whether they would shed tears in return, I don't know, and it doesn't matter. But is it empathy or is it truth? Do I just want to hear them? And then, of course, who's to judge the truth? Do I just want the truth told? Do I want empathy for Zionists, or do I just want the truth told about Zionists? And I juggle those.
Thank you, How this has been such a tour de force. Just one last question, and I'm not sure how you're going to answer this, but in Howl, Draxler begins to think that to be healed, one needed time. Between the 20th and the 21st centuries, there hadn't been time enough. I believed you had to make your own time, forget, look away, destroy the evidence and the memories, change your nature, change your attitude, change your profession, and change your name? Question mark. So I guess my last question is, what do you think is required for us to heal?
Yeah, the bit that you read is not a general statement about what Jews are like at the moment and what Jews have to fear and what Jews have to change at the moment. It grows out of Ferdinand thinking about being the son of a survivor. We've not talked about that, but his mother was in Belsen, and she feels he's a bit of a failure as a Jew, really. She's never clear what she wants him to have done other than what he has done, but he feels that there's something in her experience he has to live up to, as of course there would be if he were the son of a survivor. So it's healing from that, really. It's healing. Now, if you've not had that, I don't feel none of my family has been murdered by anti-Semites that I know of. I did visit Lithuania, and I even visited the two shtetls where my maternal grandparents, who I knew, came from, and stood in their villages and looked at their graveyards. Their graves weren't there. No Jewish graves were there. They'd gone, ripped apart, brutally ripped apart. I'm grateful that my lot got away in the 1890s, so that they didn't have to suffer any of that. Without doubt, some of the family I didn't know would have suffered 40 years later when the Germans sent the Einsatzgruppen in, and all hell broke out and the Jews who had happy relations with their Lithuanian neighbors discovered that their Lithuanian neighbors, who they thought loved them, wouldn't think twice about shooting them in the back of the neck. But that's another thing. I don't feel that that's so close to me that it's anything that I must heal from. I think that's the bit that you've quoted is interesting, I hope, but it comes from a portion of the novel that relates to that somebody who is close to that suffering, that metaphysical anguish, that actual anguish, has to deal with that. I don't think. Do I feel Jews? It would be wrong for me to say that I think I, as a Jew at the moment, need to heal. I need to know more. I need to write better. I need to think about what to do next. I need to try and make a difference. But I don't think I'm ill. I did describe when I was writing Howl to people, I'm writing this book because I'm half mad with all this. And I use the madness as a device in the novel, and Ferdinand thinks he is going mad. I don't think I have been going mad. I think I've been observing what's happening and trying to remain as calm and rational as I can. And I think that's what we need. It's not cure. It's not medical cure or psychological cure. We need to know more. We need to read more. We need to be more in possession of what we have done wrong, yes, as well as right, though I've not done anything wrong, but maybe the people to whom I think, but maybe the people to whom I give allegiance have. So we should know that. And we should also know our own histories. One of the things I say whenever I go out, because whenever I go out, people will say to me, Zoe, the daughter in this novel, whenever I go to talk at groups, they've all got a daughter or a son like Zoe. Every Jew in England has got a daughter or a son like Zoe. They come to me at the end and they go, "What to do? I've got Zoe." And I say, "Well, tell them the truth." And they say, "But they won't listen to the truth." And I say, "Well, maybe they might in time." But the damage has been done. They weren't giving the truth. They weren't given the truth early on. They were allowed. They were allowed. Well, they were sent to university, of course, and we thought this is the most horrible thing that's happened. Because after the Holocaust, which is something I said I wouldn't talk about, but after the Holocaust, we said, never again. What will help there to be a never again? Education, 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 education. Well, guess what happened? The last place you want to send a sensitive Jewish child to at the moment is university, because they will be taught, they will just be fed, not in every university, not by every professor, but in some universities, they will be fed gibberish, absolute, not just something horrible, not just because it's patently untrue, but because in the language it uses, in the shape of its discourse, it's drivel. And what we want is to have prepared our children to meet. This is what you say when this kind of professor talks to you about colonial and all the colonial set. When somebody talks to you about settler colonialism, this is what you do. You take them by the throat and you say this to them. That's what we need to prepare. That's what we need to prepare ourselves for. A better apprehension of our own. They don't know. Kids don't know. Kids are out there marching and talking about Zionism. They don't know what it is. We often make fun of the fact that there are people talking about from the river to the sea, and we can go, well, which river? Well, which sea? That's an easy one to make. What they don't know when they're talking about Zios is what a Zio is. When I've said to people, particularly if they're young people in the class, did you know that one of the early Zionists was George Eliot? They stare at me as if I'm mad. George Eliot. That's not who they see. What they see is fanatic Jews with wild beards and pickaxes and shotguns determined to run riot. They don't think that a Gentile professor and philosopher and novelist who was thought of as offering to Victorian England almost another version of Christianity could have been a Zionist. Tell them, teach them, know our own history.
Howard, we could listen to you all day. We've taken up a lot of your time already. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much. Really eye-opening for me, and we wish you continued good health and good writing. And thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. I've enjoyed every minute of talking to you. And Andrew, I can't believe I've had this good fortune to be asked to talk by Fathom.